The casserole dish left my hands before I decided to throw it. That's the part one still can't explain to anyone who asks, that there was no moment of choosing, only the dish leaving my fingers and finding the wall instead of the table, and the sound it made, which wasn't a shatter so much as a surrender. Ceramic doesn't fight. It just gives up all at once, in a burst of white and a slow, ugly bloom of beef stew running down the drywall like something wounded. "You call that dinner?" my son Peter said. He didn't even look at the wreckage. He was already turning back toward the refrigerator, already bored with his own anger, the way a man is bored with a chore he's done 100 times and expects to do 100 more. I stood in the middle of his kitchen, though I'd covered the down payment on it 11 years ago when he'd called it just a bridge loan. Temporary 6 months tops, Mom, I promise, and I said nothing. Behind him, perched at the breakfast bar on a stool that cost more than my winter coat, his wife Renata kept scrolling her phone. She didn't flinch. She didn't look up. The stew hit the wall 4 feet from her elbow, and she simply turned the volume up on whatever she was watching, as though gravy sliding down drywall were a weather event happening to someone else's house. I am 68 years old. My name is Dorothy Klein. Until 4 months before that night, I believed, with the stubborn faith of a woman who has spent her whole life being useful, that I had raised a good man. I was wrong. It would take a dead husband's secret and a stranger's letter to show me exactly how wrong, and exactly what I intended to do about it. It started with ice. Just ice, the ordinary kind, the kind I'd walked across 1,000 winters without a second thought. Except that this time my hip caught wrong on the 3rd step and my wrist took the rest, and I went down hard enough that Mrs. Alvarez next door heard it through her kitchen window and called an ambulance before I'd even finished swearing. A hairline fracture. 6 weeks in a cast. A doctor with kind eyes and a clipboard who used the word isolated the way some doctors use the word malignant, carefully, like it was its own kind of diagnosis, its own kind of danger. "You shouldn't be alone right now, Mrs. Klein. Not with the cast, not with the ice season just starting. Is there family nearby?" There was Peter. There was always Peter, my only child, 41 years old. A mortgage broker in Hartford with a wife who did something in brand strategy that I never fully understood, in a house with a kitchen island the size of my old Buick. He drove up with a U-Haul before I'd so much as agreed to anything, loading my armchair and 3 boxes of clothes into the back like the decision had already been made somewhere above my head. "Just till you're steady, Mom," he said, and I believed him because I wanted to. Because that's what you do with your children. You believe them past the point it's wise, because the alternative is admitting you raised someone who'd lie to your face and mean it kindly. The room turned out to be the unfinished half of the basement. A cot, a space heater that clicked all night like a slow clock counting down to nothing, and a door that never quite latched, so that cold air crept in around the frame no matter how I stuffed it with an old towel. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself a great many things that winter, and most of them were lies I was telling to keep from admitting a harder truth, that my son had brought me into his home the way you bring in a piece of furniture you're not sure you have room for, and had been quietly, patiently, waiting for me to make myself useful enough to earn the space I was taking up. By the 2nd month, the cast was off, my wrist mostly healed, and somehow I had become the household's entire staff. Grocery runs. Laundry for 4 people, though I never did understand who the 4th set of towels belonged to. Twice a week I drove Renata's mother to dialysis across town because, "You're not doing anything else with your time, Dorothy, it just makes sense," said with the particular brightness Renata used when she wanted something to sound like a favor to me rather than what it was. By the 3rd month, my Social Security checks had started arriving at their address. Easier for the mail, Mom, since you're here anyway. And somehow month after month, less and less of it made its way back into my actual hands. I never saw a bank statement. I never asked to. That's the part that still keeps me up some nights, turning it over like a stone I can't put down. I let it happen. Not because I was foolish and not because I didn't notice. I noticed everything the way you notice everything when you've spent a lifetime managing a household on careful math, but because Peter was my son, and I could not make myself believe that the boy who once cried over a beetle he'd stepped on by accident had grown into a man who would look at his own mother and see, instead, a line item to be managed down. The dishes were never washed correctly. The floors were never quite clean enough for Renata, who would run a fingertip along the baseboard after I'd spent an hour on my knees with a rag and sigh, just sigh, in a way that told me everything I needed to know about how she saw me. Peter's shirts, which I ironed twice a week, apparently carried creases in places creases weren't meant to be. A fact he informed me of with the flat, incurious cruelty of a man reading off a grocery list. I told myself a few more weeks. I told myself that every week for 3 months, until the weeks folded into each other and I stopped believing my own voice. And then came the casserole and the wall and the silence from the breakfast bar. And something in me that had been holding very still for a very long time simply stopped holding. I didn't clean up the stew that night. I went down to the basement, sat on the cot with the space heater clicking beside me, and for the first time in 3 months I let myself cry, not from self-pity, though there was plenty of that available, but from something closer to grief. Grief for the son I thought I'd raised. Grief for the version of my own life I'd apparently signed away somewhere between the ice on the steps and that stew hitting the wall. It was 2 days later that the letter found me, forwarded twice, the return address so thoroughly overwritten with tape and corrections that I nearly mistook it for junk mail and set it in the recycling pile with the coupon flyers. Something made me stop. Maybe it was the paper, heavier than anything else in that stack, cream-colored, the kind of paper that costs money to feel expensive. Thornberry and Associates, Trust Administration, Philadelphia. My husband Walter had been dead 8 years. A machinist his whole working life, a man of few words and steady hands, the kind of man who fixed the porch rail himself rather than calling someone. Right up until the Sunday morning his heart gave out mid-repair and I found him in the yard with the hammer still in his hand. I had buried him believing our entire estate amounted to the house, his tools, and a savings account that covered the funeral with $340 left over. I remembered that number specifically because I'd stared at it for a long time afterward, doing the math on what a life adds up to. The letter told a different story. In the dry, patient language of men paid by the hour to be careful, it explained that Walter had spent the last 15 years of his working life quietly funneling his overtime pay into an investment club run out of the machinist's credit union, the kind of unglamorous, slow-moving thing that sounds like nothing at all when you say it out loud, run by men who talked about compound interest the way other men talked about fishing trips. He had never told me. He had never touched a dollar of it. And over 15 patient years it had grown slowly, and then in the last several years not slowly at all, into a trust now valued at just under $3.1 million, held in my name, released upon proof of his death. A proof I had apparently filed and forgotten in the fog of that terrible spring 8 years ago, never once imagining what it might one day unlock. There was a second page. His handwriting, kept on file with the trust to be released alongside everything else. That if you're reading this I'm gone, and you're in some kind of spot, because that's the only reason Thornberry would have mailed it out instead of just letting it sit. I never told you about this because I didn't want you loving me for the money, and I didn't want you counting on me instead of yourself. You were always the strongest person I ever knew, stronger than you gave yourself credit for. This isn't a gift. It's proof. Go be exactly as strong as I always saw you being. W. I sat on the edge of that cot for a long time. The space heater clicked. Upstairs, faintly, I could hear Renata laughing at something on the television, the sound of a life continuing exactly as it had been, unaware that the ground beneath it had just quietly, invisibly shifted. I did not cry that time. I got up and for the first time in 3 months I stood up straight. I told them I had a follow-up doctor's appointment in the city and would be gone overnight. Peter barely looked up from his phone. Fine, Mom. Take a car service, don't drive yourself in this weather. He said it the way you'd remind someone to take an umbrella. A small courtesy extended to a piece of furniture he still, in some distracted corner of his mind, felt obligated to maintain. Thornberry turned out to be a small, precise man with reading glasses pushed up into a shock of white hair. The kind of person who has spent so many years handling other people's fortunes that he's developed a permanent, gentle formality, as though every conversation might be someone's most important one. He treated me the way people treat a woman who has money, which is to say he actually listened. There's one more matter, he said, near the end of our 2 hours together, sliding a folder across the desk. Your husband's investment club pooled some of its gains into real estate in the 1990s. Rental properties mostly bought when they were cheap and held. Most were sold off over the years by the club's trustees. One, however, is still held directly in your trust. He tapped the folder. A single-family home. Hartford, Connecticut. Larkspur Court. I knew the address before I'd finished reading it upside down. I knew it because I had spent the last 3 months sleeping in its basement. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment because it wasn't triumph, not yet. It was something colder and stranger. A kind of vertigo, the sensation of the floor tilting to reveal a trapdoor that had been beneath my feet the entire time. My son's house, the house I'd co-signed for, the house I'd been mopping on my knees for 12 weeks, had been sitting this entire time inside the quiet architecture of my husband's 15-year secret. Peter had never known his mortgage had been restructured years ago into a private lease held by an anonymous trust. He'd simply been told back when it happened that the bank sold the loan, and being Peter had never once asked a follow-up question, because asking questions had never been among his particular talents. "I'd like to speak with whoever manages that lease," I said. And I heard my own voice come out steady, almost pleasant, the voice of a woman discussing the weather. "Of course, Mrs. Klein." Thornberry didn't blink. Men like him have seen every version of this story. I understood, watching his face, that mine was neither the first nor the strangest he'd witnessed. "Would you like me to draft the transfer of full operational authority to you personally? Currently the trustees manage it on your behalf, per the original club agreement. But as sole beneficiary you're entitled to assume direct control at any time." "Yes," I said. "Effective immediately, if that's possible." "It is." He was already writing. "May I ask, is there anything specific you have in mind for the property?" I thought about the space heater clicking through the night. I thought about the towel stuffed in the gap under a door that never quite closed. I thought about Renata's fingertip along the baseboard, and the particular size she made, engineered precisely to make me feel my whole existence was an inconvenience she was too gracious to name outright. "I have several things in mind, Mr. Thornberry," I said. "We'll get to all of them." I did not go back to Larkspur Court that night. I checked into a hotel downtown with a view of the river, and for the first time in 3 months I slept in a bed that wasn't a cot, under a comforter that didn't smell faintly of the basement's damp concrete. In the morning I ordered coffee from room service and drank it slowly, at a table by the window, watching the river move without needing to be anywhere. Then I went shopping. Not the frantic, self-conscious shopping of a woman trying to prove something, but the unhurried kind, the kind I hadn't done in years. A wool coat that actually fit through the shoulders, 2 suits in colors I hadn't worn since before Walter died. A pair of low-heeled shoes built for a woman who intended to be on her feet and taken seriously. At a salon 2 blocks from the hotel, a young man named Desmond cut my hair into a sharp, elegant bob and called me ma'am in a way that felt, for the first time in a long time, like respect rather than dismissal. I looked in the mirror afterward and didn't entirely recognize the woman looking back. And then a half-second later I did. She was the woman who'd run our farmhouse's books for 30 years without a single overdraft. The woman who'd talked a bank loan officer down from a punishing interest rate with nothing but patience and a legal pad of her own calculations. The woman who had, somewhere along the way, allowed herself to be folded up small enough to fit into a basement, and who was now slowly unfolding. I called the property management firm that afternoon from the hotel room, a cup of tea going cold at my elbow. "Boston Realty Management, no, forgive me, Hartford Realty Partners." The woman on the phone corrected herself when I misspoke, and I let out a small laugh because even my nerves were finding this funny now. "How can I help you?" "This is Dorothy Klein," I said. "I'm the beneficial owner, as of this morning, of the trust holding the deed to a property on Larkspur Court. I'd like to review the current lease terms." There was a pause, the particular pause of someone pulling up a file. "One moment, Mrs. Klein. Yes, here we are. The lease is held by a Peter and Renata Klein, current tenants of record. Rate's been fixed at the same figure for going on 11 years now. Looks like an old courtesy rate extended by the previous trustee. Quite a bit under current market, if you don't mind me saying." "I don't mind at all," I said. "I'd like a new lease drawn up. Full current market rate. Effective the 1st of next month." Another pause, longer this time. "Ma'am, that would represent, let me just check the comps, somewhere near a 300% increase. The current tenants have no idea the rate's been below market. This is going to come as quite a shock to them." "I imagine it will," I said, and took a sip of my cooling tea. "Please have the notice delivered to the residents tomorrow morning, in writing, through the standard channel. And send a copy to this email address." I gave her the new account I'd set up that morning, clean and separate from anything Peter or Renata had ever seen. "So I have my own record." "Of course, Mrs. Klein. Will there be anything else? I thought of the casserole dish and the wall and Renata's phone screen glowing 3 feet away, indifferent to the sound of gravy sliding down drywall. I thought of the towel stuffed under a door that never quite closed. Yes, I said. One more thing. I'd like the tenants' names removed from any documentation identifying me as the property owner. For now. I want to deliver that particular detail in person. I went back to Larkspur Court the next evening, not as a returning houseguest but as a woman arriving somewhere she had every right to be. I wore the new coat. I did not knock. I still had a key, though I suspected that would change within the week. Peter was at the kitchen island. His island, or so he still believed, scrolling through something on his laptop with the particular scowl he wore whenever a deal wasn't closing fast enough for his liking. Renata sat across from him, a glass of wine in hand, and for once her phone was down, replaced by a single sheet of paper she was staring at with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Something close to fear. "Mom," Peter said, glancing up and then doing a genuine double-take at the coat, the hair, the shoes. "You look, where have you been? We've been calling you for 2 days." "I had some business to attend to," I said, setting my purse down on the counter with the calm of a woman who has decided, finally and completely, not to apologize for her own existence. Renata slid the paper across the island without a word. I already knew what it said. I'd received my own copy that morning, forwarded from the property management firm, but I picked it up anyway and read it slowly, the way you read something you want the other person to watch you read. "This has to be a mistake," Renata said, her voice tight in a way I'd never heard from her before, all the practiced brightness stripped out of it. "A 300% rent increase? Effective next month?" "Peter, call the bank. This has to be some kind of clerical error." "It isn't a bank," I said. "It hasn't been a bank in over a decade, actually. It's a private trust." Peter looked at me, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. Not understanding yet, not quite, but the first flicker of unease, the animal sense that the ground has changed beneath you before your conscious mind has caught up to why. "What are you talking about, Mom?" "I'm talking," I said, and I made myself say it slowly, made myself enjoy every syllable of it after 3 months of biting my tongue in that very kitchen, about the fact that this house belongs to a trust established by your father before he died. A trust one control. Which makes me, as of yesterday afternoon, your landlord. The silence that followed was the most satisfying sound I had heard in 3 months. Renata's glass of wine sat forgotten, condensation sliding down its side. Peter's mouth opened and then closed, opened again. That's not possible," he said. "The bank restructured our loan years ago, they told us." "They told you it had been sold," I said. Which was true. It was sold to your father's investment club, and then held in trust, and then upon his death it became mine, along with quite a bit else you never knew existed. I only learned about it myself 2 days ago. Your father kept it quiet his entire life. He didn't want it to change how anyone treated him. I let that sentence sit in the air for a moment before I added softly, "I understand the impulse rather better than I used to." "Mom, come on." Peter's voice shifted into the wheedling register I remembered from his childhood, the one he used to use to talk his way out of trouble with his father. We're your family. You're not actually going to charge us triple rent." "I'm not charging you anything," I said. "The property management firm set the rate at fair market value. The same rate any other tenant in this neighborhood would pay. I simply removed a courtesy discount that neither of you knew you were receiving and neither of you have ever, in 11 years, thanked anyone for." "We can't afford triple rent," Renata said, and there it was, the fear cracking all the way through now, no brightness left to disguise it. "Peter, tell her we can't. You built an entire kitchen renovation around a marble island that cost more than a small car," I said, and I did not raise my voice because I had learned over 3 months in that basement that a quiet voice carries further than a loud one when the person speaking finally means every word. "I imagine you'll find a way to manage your finances if you put the same energy into it that you put into the counters." Peter's face had gone the particular red I remembered from his teenage years, the color he turned right before he either slammed a door or said something he'd regret. "You're doing this because of the other night? Because I got a little frustrated about dinner." "I'm doing this," I said, "because for 3 months I have been your unpaid housekeeper, your unpaid driver, your unpaid cook, and for nights ago your father-in-law's, I'm sorry, your wife's mother's, unpaid caretaker on top of it. I did all of that because I believed foolishly that it was what a mother does, that it would be temporary, and that somewhere underneath the ice in this kitchen there was still a boy who loved me. I am not doing this out of spite, Peter. I am doing this because I didn't move out that night, though I very much wanted to. There is a particular pleasure, I discovered, in taking your time about a departure once you no longer need permission for it. I gave the property management firm one more instruction before I left the kitchen that evening. A formal 90-day notice, delivered through proper legal channels, informing the tenants of record that the trust would not be renewing the lease at the end of the current term. 90 days was more generosity than I strictly owed them, and I knew it. I gave it anyway, not for Peter's sake, and certainly not for Renata's, but because Walter's letter was still folded in my coat pocket, and somewhere in his careful, patient handwriting was a lesson I intended to actually learn rather than simply repeat back to my son as cruelty. That strength doesn't require you to become the thing that wronged you. I moved back into the basement for exactly one more week, not because I had to, but because I wanted to watch with my own eyes what happens to a house once its residents realize the ground beneath their certainty has shifted. Peter spent most of that week on the phone, first with lawyers who quoted him retainers he clearly hadn't expected, then with his own father-in-law asking, I heard this part through the thin basement ceiling, whether they might just move in for a while temporarily until we sort this out. Renata spent the week not looking at me at all, which I found honestly almost restful after 3 months of being looked at only when I'd failed at something. On the 8th day, I packed my 2 suitcases, the same 2 I'd arrived with, though everything inside them was new now, and called a car service to take me to an apartment I'd already leased, a bright 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building with an elevator and, more importantly, a door that closed all the way. Peter caught me in the driveway as the driver loaded my bags. You're really doing this, he said. Not a question. I already did it, I said. I'm simply leaving now that it's finished. He looked, for one unguarded moment, almost like the boy who'd cried over the beetle. I don't understand what happened to you, Mom. Nothing happened to me, Peter, I said, and I meant it as gently as I could manage because some part of me, a smaller, quieter part than the one that had thrown a casserole dish at a wall, still hoped there was a version of this conversation that ended in something other than a closed door. Something happened for me. Your father left me a shield, and it turns out I still remembered how to hold one. I only wish it hadn't taken 3 months in a basement to remind me. He didn't have an answer for that. I got into the car and did not look back at the house, because I had already spent 3 months looking at nothing else. I won't pretend the story ends there in some neat, satisfying bow because life rarely does. Peter and Renata did move eventually into a smaller rental 2 towns over. A decent place from what I understand, though considerably less marble in the kitchen. We speak now, occasionally, carefully, the way 2 people speak when they're both aware a bridge was badly damaged and neither is entirely sure it can bear weight again. He has apologized once in a phone call that lasted 11 minutes and included several long silences. I told him I appreciated it. I didn't tell him it was enough because it wasn't, not yet, and I decided somewhere in that basement that I was done pretending things were resolved simply because pretending was easier than sitting with the truth. I used some of the trust to fix my own porch rail, the one Walter never finished, hiring a contractor instead of trying to manage it myself with a bad wrist and a stubborn streak. I used some of it to set up a small scholarship at the community college in Walter's name, for machinist kids who wanted something more than the trade their fathers had worked. A decision I made alone on a Tuesday afternoon, with Thornberry's patient help and nobody's permission but my own. And I kept the letter. Not framed, not displayed, just folded still in the same coat pocket, moved carefully each time I change coats for the season, because some mornings I still need to read it. You were always the strongest person I ever knew, stronger than you gave yourself credit for. Walter was a quiet man his whole life, careful with money and even more careful with words, and it turns out the last thing he ever gave me wasn't the $3 million at all. It was permission. Permission to stop being useful on other people's terms, and start being exactly as strong as he'd always known I was. The woman who ran a farmhouse without a single overdraft, who talked a bank into a fairer rate with nothing but a legal pad and patience, who had simply, for one long and grinding winter, forgotten she still knew how. I don't forget anymore. I keep the door to my new apartment locked not out of fear but out of habit, the good kind, the kind you build when you finally remember that a door is supposed to close all the way, and that you are the one who gets to decide who's allowed through it.